Okay, you should all see that on there. Okay, so this is welcome to conversation about gender and the matrix. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just if we can just sort of check in and see. I'm going to throw up I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to show you one slide with some questions on it. Then I'd like us to just sort of come back and dialogue a little bit. Okay. And then we can see where we want to go. I got a couple of different options where we can go more directly into the matrix, more into gender, and then their intersection. So let me share my screen real fast. And what I'm going to do is just throw up a few questions, see how they resonate with you, and then let's come back and just talk about what kinds of things we might want to know about between these two concepts of gender and the matrix. So here's my screen. Share this real fast. Okay. Okay, so here's just some basic ideas for us this is just designed to prompt you. And then, like I said, we'll come back in dialogue. So what is this thing called the influence matrix? What is the core social need? This is, to me, here, I got some, understanding this core social need is really, really important. So I want to make sure that we get some notions about that. How do we apply the influence matrix, both intrapsychically, what's happening inside, and interpersonally between people? Then what are gender differences? Okay. What is the gender binary? You hear that term a lot. What do we mean by that term? Why do people say, hey, I'm gender non-binary or related terms? Why is there so much controversy, debate, debating what sex and gender is and whether or not there are differences? What's the danger in talking about them? We should be clear about why, what people, their ideological and justice concerns. When we talk about how do we understand sex gender differences? What is the contribution of nature versus nurture? And I'll then follow that up by saying, why is this a bad way of framing the issue? How does culture shape gender? How do we think about the role evolution has played? And you will hear, if you get into the world of human differences, gender, sex differences, cultural versus evolutionary explanations are prominent. And what are they? How do we understand them? In general, what's the debate in the field, and how does the unified metapsychology framework say? How much sexism is there in today's United States society? How do we understand that sexism? How has sexism changed? Where are we headed in sexist kind of inequalities? And ultimately then linking the two, fundamentally, what does the matrix say about human psychological differences between girls and boys, men and women? And ultimately, so that's the linkage. So let's bring us together and open it up. If you come off mute, if you have comments or questions, that's just a smorgasbord of possible things. But really, this is a topic for us to come together and share questions, opinions, things that you'd want to know, things that you'd want us to reflect on as a group. So what would you like to, when you came here today, what were you hoping we might discuss? Yeah, Zach.
So I'd like to, at some point, maybe not as the first thing, but I'd like to know how you, and I've actually studied matrix and I understand parts of it. I don't claim to understand everything about it, especially some of these questions are really deep and difficult for me to even conceive. I was just wondering how you came up with this matrix itself. Like when in this evolution of all the different concepts that you have, when did this emerge for you?
Great. Yeah, so actually it's a great question. I'll just say fairly quickly. The influence matrix emerged pretty close with the beginning, very near in the mid-1990s with the justification hypothesis. So I was thinking about people's motives in the social world and their reasoning in the social world in 1996. And I was tracking the importance of social influence, okay, as a really interesting intersection of ideas. So social influence, by the way, is a concept that can be either thought of as a resource, okay? So how much social influence do you have? In other words, which can be defined as how easy it is, can you get other people to behave in accordance with your interests? All right, so that can thought of as a resource. People have lots of social influence. Hey, you get lots of people working for you. You can tell them what to do, or you can get them to behave in accordance with their interests. A homeless person that nobody knows, very little social influence. Very difficult to get people to behave in accordance with your. And then there's social influence as a process, okay? Social influence as a process refers to, well, you just asked a question and I responded, okay? So what are the ways in which people serve as stimuli? What are the reciprocal feedback loops between how people interact to create patterns of influence, all right? And I was influenced by Timothy Leary, and I was also influenced by attachment theory. And I was thinking about the ways in which people engaged in discourse in the mid-1990s prior to the justification hypothesis. And so they intersected quite a bit. And then as that idea took place and as I developed behavioral investment theory, then it solidified in terms of its current form. About 1999 or so, it was pretty close to its current form. Yeah. Great. Other questions about matrix and gender? Yeah, Waldemar?
I find the matrix very useful to understand interpersonal interactions. I kind of see it as the machine is, if you will, is the relational value. What was the other one? Relational value.
Relational value and social influence are the two.
Social
RVSI, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I see that sort of as the central machine, if you will, and that there are the other bits and pieces around the matrix are the bits and pieces that operate in the machine.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I operate the machine is different than, for instance, the way you operate the machine. There'll probably be lots of similarities, but there'll be differences as well. But when I look at that, it's clear that each one of those vectors is a dimensional spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And that the final one, the final machine, the RVSI, that is something where for us to be, if you will, well-balanced individuals and successful in our interpersonal interactions, that we need to find the, if you will, the happy medium for us between each end of the scale, because one end of the scale is social influence, and the other end of the scale is relational value. So I see that there are some people who sacrifice relational value for social influence.
Right. That's a very, yeah.
And vice versa too.
Yep, absolutely. Well, right. So this is a real tension. You'll experience this, okay? So social influence is your ability to pragmatically move people, and relational value is the extent to which you are known and valued by others, okay? Now, they can fuse together, okay? In other words, to be known and valued is to have, in many ways, social influence.
Yeah.
So if I love my child, okay, I value them, and they are suffering, guess what I do? I will work on their behalf in the best way possible to honor that. But at the same time, you can also manipulate people to achieve social influence that would down the road potentially cost you serious relational value. So these two concepts are fused together in the sense that they interplay off of each other. Okay? But they also are potentially separate. So the more Machiavellian, so somebody who's a sociopath, for example, will tend to be much more oriented towards social influence and manipulation than relational value.
Yeah, that's said far better than I did, but that's what I meant.
It's a very, well, you're bringing up a really important, the dynamics between social influence and relational value actually are very, very tricky and require quite a bit of elaboration to get the rich texture between those two variables appropriate. Okay. But I will say, so actually, why don't I just bring up some of the slides I did on the matrix if there's some questions, and we can go into that, and I can offer some of review on that, and then that will set the stage, maybe coming back for some of the questions in relation to the gender. So just so are oriented, the matrix on the theory of knowledge tree, the matrix is the fourth branch, okay? In terms of its location in the unified theory, you have the tree of knowledge system, behavioral investment theory, which is the framework for understanding animal behavior, the animal mind, that provides the foundation for the influence matrix, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about what this is right here. This is perception, motivation, and emotion, and the influence matrix is a map that is informed by the perception, motive. I know you can't see it really easy. And this serves as your heart, your relational heart, okay? What we mean by that is the core of your phenomenological being is a very core guiding. So when I work in the psychotherapy world, when I work about when people come in and they talk about the injuries that they've had, all right, the vast majority of traumas that people have had go to the core of their relational being. They may have been physically injured by somebody, and of course that creates one kind of trauma, but almost always there's a relational dynamic of betrayal, of rejection, of being ignored, abandoned, devalued in some particular way, in ways that people longed for. And I'll see more about that. And then ultimately, this underlying heart sets the stage and serves as a guide. This is the experiential intuitive system. The matrix guides a lot of that, where we are then shining the flashlight of our verbal consciousness and trying to justify what we're doing, either to ourselves privately or to others, guided by a context of relational dynamics. And so these are the four ideas that make up the unified theory and their interrelations. In terms of some other things, this basically says, yes, the matrix is guiding. We sit in a culture person plane of existence of justification and an animal mental plane of primate dynamics, meaning we're reading each other in nonverbal ways. And intrapsychically and interpersonally, we're guided on power, love, and freedom, and regulating our social relational matrix. It means that there's basically coordinates of social value where people are close to each other, where there's a vertical dimension of control. I think I saw Joe Mikulski sign on here. He'll be able to talk about sort of the broad dynamics of social force in relationship to, well, who has power vertically, who is connected to people. The matrix will offer lenses and maps for that. In relationship to, if you go into the sort of the model of personality and psychotherapy I work from, CAST, there are 5 systems of adaptation. Habits, your basic system of operating. Then you have a phenomenological, perceptual, experiential system that's organized by emotion. Okay? And then the extension of that is the self-other relational system. And that serves as a core of your primate thinking. You then have a justification system, defense filtering. That gets back to some of the other dynamics. Okay, so to then understand the matrix history, it connects to what's called the Timothy Leary, who was famous for his acid dropping, tune in, drop out. But before that, he was a Harvard psychologist who generated the circumplex model that has 2 axes of dominance and nurturance. And that shows up in many, many different places. And the matrix can be thought of as having a direct lineage with the circumplex model. The matrix is also, if you understand how to use it, very intimately related with Bowlby and the attachment theory, and the need for having your high relational value needs met is going to send a signal that you're protected, that you're safe in a relational context. Low relational value needs are going to trigger insecure attachments and then strategies for regulating them, and they take place in a relational dance of engagement. Okay. So what is the influence matrix? These are the key components of it. So the first thing that we want to understand is the RVSI black line. This is the tracking barometer of either you're tracking some combination of social influence or relational value. Inside each of us, they have a template for high relational value, okay? This is the core experience. When you're engaged in who you are, this is the intuitional experience you have of somebody having unconditional positive regard. If you've been in a case where you've fallen in love with somebody and they've fallen in love with you, that is a fusion of high relational value when you fall romantically in love with somebody. It is you seeing them and valuing them and wanting to be with them and them mirroring that back to you. And when people fall in love, what happens to them? It's a spiritual experience, basically. They're transformed into, they're on cloud nine in relation because they're getting this core unconditional need met. Now, I encourage everybody to think here about some miserable times that they've had, maybe in high school or other instances where you felt really wounded. And my guess is that the themes of the memory will be times in which you were rejected by important people, whether they abandoned you in particular ways, whether they disrespected you, whether you thought you had influence in ways that you deserved that you then realized you didn't. So are you on the outside of an in-group? Okay. Are you exposed with prejudice or bias in a particular way? Did you fall in love with somebody and they didn't love you back? Or did they fall out of love with you? Okay. All of these are going to be core archetypal injuries to your relational value system. All right. And what you're doing in much of your life is tracking a barometer and trying to protect high relational value, trying to move towards situations that afford that, and trying to avoid or defend against the loss of relational value, because that, and a lot of your trauma and psychological defenses will have roots in the times in which you experienced core relational value injury. Okay. But the matrix says, well, how do you get relational value? Well, it divides this up into two different domains. One are content domains. So, well, okay, somebody will be very attracted to you and they'll take you out for a drink, okay, or give you an award or do all these other kinds of issues. Those are content elements. But then there are what's really, the way your mind really tracks is, although it has content, it tracks positionality and process, which means it places you in relationship to the other person you're engaged with on self-other process dimensions, okay? So what this argues is that you track yourself in relationship to other on a vertical dimension of a rank, and rank is assessed both in direct terms, so who has more seniority, power, a parent over a child, a boss over an employee. In more primitive days, a master over a slave. That's direct power, okay? Or indirect power means that, hey, you have more merit, you have higher achievement scores, you have more wealth, okay? You have more of the indicators of achievement and performance rank. That sets the stage for the vertical dimension of ranking. And loosely, we can identify the domains as dominance and submissive, although, as I was saying, there are a lot of different shades of each of these dimensions, okay? The most distinct dimension is direct control versus indirect control on what we call here the power dimension, okay? So people are constantly seeing where they are vertically in place in the social coordinates. How much attention does somebody get? How much deference? Who speaks? Who interrupts? All of these are indicators of rank and power. The second dimension is hostility and affiliation. Affiliation is called the love dimension, emphasizing the positive. Affiliation is when you fuse your interests with another. And in fact, actually, your brain really does work that way. It will represent your interests, it will represent the other, and actually will create static, okay? So that you feel their pain, you hope for their joys, and you will work on their behalf, and you internalize who they are. To affiliate means to become one with. All right? This is a fusion so that you then share the other, and the essence of love across all the different kinds of love, like romantic love, agape, etc., is to fuse with the other's interests. We do this, of course, in very different ways when we have friendships, when we have our group identity, when we have a romantic partner. Hostility is the opposite, in the sense that you differentiate the other person's interests and see the other person's activity or interest as potentially antithetical or interrupting your own or threatening you with low relational value and loss of interest. So you then become actively, to be hostile is to be in a punishing, blaming orientation, to restrict the other person's interests, to restrict their activity so that it doesn't damage you. And then you will either realign with them, i.e. stop doing this and start to do this, or distance yourself. I'm going to punish you and move away. To understand the realignment versus punishment, it's helpful to understand the third process dimension. That's autonomy. That's when I'm going to be self-determined. I'm going to be free from obligation and influence and move away. Or dependency, which means I recognize my enmeshment and I need you to be a particular way so that I'm okay. Okay. To achieve high relational value and social influence is generally considered a balance between rank and power. Power and love. Too much rank can threaten love. Try that in your relationships. Try to become very controlling and see what your significant others do. Okay. You will see that there's a tension there. And between a healthy degree of autonomy and interdependency. Extreme dependency, extreme autonomy, which is called counterdependence in the full language of the matrix, hostility and submission are defenses against loss of or reacting to, but by the way, they also create systemal feedback loop where you tend to lose more and more relationship as you try to defend against it, or you're in a vulnerable position with those extremes. These are the underlying motives that orient people in relationship to one another. These are the goal states. So generally what you're trying to do is achieve high relational value through an effective balance of autonomy, dependency, affiliation, and dominance. You have emotions that orient you towards changes and energize you. Motive means you energize movement towards certain things. So love, and I mean this broadly, is the feeling that says, oh, I want their interests. I want to stay with them. I want to be them. Okay. I want to hold them in a romantic sense, or I want to hold them in a parent sense. I want to hang with them as a friend. I want to join Black Lives Matter as an affiliative group. I want to internalize and support their interests. Okay. So love is the feeling of identity and protection and fusion with the interests of the other. Pride is what we experience when we achieve, okay, our dominance ranking in a particular way. So you get a perfect score on your SATs, all right? Or you just go out and buy a car that you can afford because you were successful in making money. Right? These are self-elevating. And the general experience of high relational value, social influence is joy, pleasure. If you anticipate it, it creates a hopeful state. Oh, she's going to love me, or I'm going to get this job, or I'm going to buy this house. Okay. These are, and they energize you to approach. And then if you are able to achieve your goals, then you will feel that feeling and then ultimately consummate that and feel relaxed and content. If you aren't, you will then get frustrated and start to feel negative affect responses for your failure to achieve the goals that you hope for. In contrast, if you start losing influence, okay, in various ways, you have a set of emotional responses that orient you to rebalance this. And so if you start losing influence in ways that other people are competing with you or punishing you, then you have anger is when your self-interests are being challenged in a particular way, okay, that you deem to be outside of equity and fairness, and your interests are being impinged upon by somebody else who's behaving, and you get angry to orient them. Hatred is the ultimate rejection of the individual. Sadness is when, and pain and fear is the anticipation of it. The forced submission, failure, vulnerability, inferiority gives rise to the cluster of shame feelings. Embarrassment, humiliation, and shame are all the cousins of inferiority and ineffectiveness. And finally, guilt orients you towards the interests of the other, makes you to repair when you feel like you've done something you ought not to have done, that you need people to be connected to. The final elements in relationship to this is that you can see that there are two, and this actually becomes very relevant if we talk about the gender. There are two quadrants. The upper left, which is a self quadrant, which involves rewarding self over other or punishing other relative to self. These are when we're navigating self-other tensions and we're saying, hey, I deserve, I should come up or you should come down. And then you have the other-oriented quadrant, whereby you elevate the needs of the other and reduce or punish the needs of the self. Okay. So this is called the other-oriented quadrant, and this is called the self-oriented quadrant. Okay. This is called the high relational value quadrant, the low relational value quadrant. So this system, one other thing I'll say about the system, then I'll come back, okay, is to talk a little bit about how it works. Now, it's fuzzy for some reason. So to understand the way the matrix works, it is helpful to understand what's called the PME equation. This is perception, motive, and emotion. And the basic way this works is that you have templates for what you want to be, okay? You'll have an idea of what you want to see and what you don't want to see. That will be in your head, okay? That's called motivation, which are goal, you can't read this, is goal states that you want to approach. Hey, high relational value. Goal states I want to avoid, low relational value, okay? Perception is where you are in relationship to other, okay? And emotion is how you feel, okay? A classic perceptual control example is with fried eggs. You have an image of what a fried egg looks like. You're sitting there, it's in the morning, you're like, oh, I want fried eggs, okay? And then what you will do is you'll see where you are, and then you want to move toward your approach state. So the first thing you do is you get up and you go to the fridge. And if all of a sudden you realize you have no eggs, you go, oh, bummer, okay? That interrupted your goal. If you have eggs, then you're able to make an egg, you crack it. If you break the yolk, you know it's not perfect, you say, notice you get a negative jolt of energy every time you can't meet your goal. And as you move towards perfection, you finally sit down and you say, oh, I've got the perfect egg, you'll feel satisfied, okay? So emotions are constantly feeding back. Now, I remember one of the first interesting displays of the relationship between motive and emotion was my professor in integrative psychotherapy. And he was telling me he was an anxious guy trying to date. And he would tell me something that I could empathize with, although I found Andy in high school, so I didn't have to date too much, but I could relate to this. So he would tell me about how he'd be in a bar and he'd see an attractive woman and he'd have an approach-oriented goal state, okay? And then that would activate in him a desire to go over there and see her. And while he had that, he would then be energized and he'd start walking over to the bar. Then he would have the image that she would reject him, okay? And because actually fear operates on a different time scale than desire. Fear becomes accelerant very fast when you're about ready to do a contact. The fear line would cross his approach line, and he would walk halfway over, turn around, and walk back. Okay, that's what's called an approach avoidance conflict. All right, and now it's often the case that you can actually approach things in the long term, because actually that's a long-term vision. Avoidance is a more short-term vision. And as you get near it, it's like run away. And then he said I'd walk like an idiot around the bar in a circle, never finishing either running away or moving towards her. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and see how that summary landed. The self-other quadrants will get us into potential gender dynamics if you want to move in that direction. But let me stop there and see what questions might emerge in relationship to that summary.
Well, I have a question. It seems to me that some of the matrix parts are acquired in life. We're not born with them, but others, I think, we're born with some elements of them. Would you address that?
Yeah. So so basically, you want to think about it kind of like as you're born prepared with the basic architectural schema of the matrix. Okay. In other words, you are prepared. So you'll have a template for high relational value. You'll have a template for low relational value. You'll have an intuitive capacity to evaluate rank. You'll have an intuitive capacity to evaluate love and hostility, an intuitive capacity to evaluate involvement. Okay. Now, if you follow, for instance, if folks are familiar with like Erik Erikson, and his psychosocial developmental stages. So the first thing for Erik Erikson is trust versus mistrust. All right. And that's a develop. So what Erik Erikson doing is really, in my opinion, what he's doing is he's tracking the key elements of the architecture of the matrix across a lifespan developmental emergence. Okay. So the first thing is, are you going to be trusted as an infant? Can I trust mom and dad to fundamentally take care of me and place me in a secure attachment? Okay. And receive love. So that's sort of the first track. All right. Or not. And I won't get my love needs met. And that creates more activity, more, if we want to do it, neurological involvement with the low social influence. Okay. And if you know the history of attachment, then that will orient some people to be more hyper dependent and be very sensitive to send off alarms, be crying a lot. Or they'll actually suppress that need, become more avoidant, and try to be more independent, hyper independent, and distant. That's how they compensate. Insecure attachment babies compensate for the dance of attachment. Okay. And you can see that green line then begin to emerge and play out. Okay. So what you have is you have the basic architecture, and then you have the learning, relationally developmental dance that fills in that architecture with episodic experiences, pre-verbal now, if we're talking about young, episodic experiences that then serve as the person's unique template for attaching to mom and dad, for understanding their place. Okay. Then we go from basic trust into autonomy versus doubt. That's when the child actually can get up, walk around, distance themselves, begin to move and see how independent they are versus how vulnerable they may be, and run back to mom to require protection. So that's that green line start to develop. And then when they move into early development, like in kindergarten, they get industry versus inferiority, for example. That's when they really start to see whether or not they can achieve effectively relative to other kids. And kindergartners, you better believe, they will be tracking. How well did I draw relative to my friend draw? Who got the most stickers? How am I doing? How popular am I? They don't ask that necessarily that question, but believe me, they are tracking their rank and popularity by the time they're in kindergarten, big time. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Thank you.
Corinne, then Zach.
I was wondering, it makes sense on the individual level. Is there also a way it fits in regards to society? Like I'm thinking of submission, and there are groups obviously that aren't given as much power or respect, so they could be in that part of the circle.
Absolutely.
Not just individually, but just like in general, there would tend to be a push towards that because of things are that way.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, absolutely. So this is your intuitive tracking. Okay. So now you enter into a society, and let's say white people are valued and people of color are not valued. Right. And you go in, and kids are pattern detectors. They'll immediately say, well, all the white kids are getting special attention. All the dolls are white, blah, blah, blah. I need to know my place in the social matrix. Absolutely. Because if you misjudge your place, another story I tell is actually from my high school friends. If you misjudge your place, you're in trouble. Okay. In other words, you think you have power and you don't have power. You enter into the thing, oh, everyone needs to listen to me. And the group is like, no, you're a submissive person. You try to assert power, the group's you will punish you seriously. Okay. So it's absolutely the cultural justifications and the social matrix of who has power will immediately send signals to where that person feels like they should be based on, say, a social identity category. Absolutely. Zach?
So along the lines of what Waldemar was asking, I'm just wondering, like I look at a family unit, when you have multiple children in one family unit, and the differences in them. So I know a particular family, for example. So they have a daughter and two sons.
Yep.
Grew up, of course, in the same household, same parents, right? Same city. All of them are born in the same place. And one of them is super like dominant and autonomous. Like you could see the autonomy level and dominance level super high in one of them. The other two are normal, like very shy, introverted, insecure kids. So could you explain, like, how much, again, I know the nurturers and nurturers is not the right framing of this, right? And so my question is, the nervous system somehow of when you're born, people with higher dominance and high autonomy, is their nervous system constructed differently than people who are more neurotic, for example?
Mhm. Yeah, so this is a great question. Absolutely, I believe, and certainly Mike and I can dialogue a little bit about this, but here's my basic framing. I'll come back and I'll go back and share so you can see if we look at the matrix, because this is going to be helpful to see. So the matrix has in it 3 of the major temperamental, there are 5 big traits, okay, which are really classes of dispositions that are useful in reliably identifying individuals as on dimensions of difference in terms of their tendency to behave in certain circumstances, okay? And we do know that if we know your parents, there is a heritability quotient, which means that we can predict, your biological parents predict where you tend to fall, but not by about 50%, we'll say, of predictability. Okay, but that's not means that 50% is determined by genes. So we got to be careful about our language. But it is actually the case that if you have parents that are very, very neurotic biological parents, you're much more likely to have children who are neurotic biological parents. Interestingly, very little is accounted for by your natural parents directly by their behavior on mirroring. I'll talk about that in a second, okay? That's a complicated argument. But actually, when we look at shared environments versus whatever, let me just explain the concept, though. So neuroticism, in the unified theory, neuroticism refers to the activity and sensitivity of the negative emotion system. I'll say that. The activity and sensitivity of the negative emotion system, okay? So where does your negative emotion system idle? Okay, does it idle at a 7 versus a 3? How quickly does a stimulus trigger it? How extreme does it pop when a trigger happens? And how long does it take to get back to baseline? These are all the features of neuroticism. Somebody that's very high in neuroticism will idle at a high level. Little things will bother them a lot. They'll have a hard time getting back to baseline, okay? Now, the tendency to have that is clearly related at some level to your behavioral genetic history, meaning your parents, their biological temperament biases you or predisposes you to be in that vulnerability by a somewhat of a degree. Almost half the variance is accounted for, okay? But that doesn't mean it would be surprising that, if you're neurotic, you have some neurotic kids, but one isn't, etc. Okay, but generally that would be the case. So behavioral disposition, extroversion refers to the extent to which an individual is both charged by positive emotion and has active energy and is socially gregarious. Okay, there's a facet of extroversion that both connects not only to positive emotion and energy, but in particular to sociality and engagement. So high extroversion, lots of that. Low extroversion, sometimes called introversion, is social disengagement and concern about social activity and shyness, okay? And then finally, the matrix really represents what's called agreeableness. Agreeableness is your interpersonal style of relating, and whether you're tender-minded, empathetic, sensitive, go along, hey, take care of other people, don't worry about that, or you're critical, edgy, disagreeable, much more likely to express hostility. Now, I say interpersonal style because it's really more of the temperamental style that you have, not so much your underlying motivational structure, which can vary quite a bit. In other words, sometimes people are temperamental or agreeable, but actually they're kind of manipulative and bitter. And sometimes people are actually the disagreeable old man with a heart of gold. That's definitely plausible and reasonable too. So the short answer is behavioral genetics will create some variance. Then individuals will be channeled based on their experiences into complexes of adaptive patterns. And if they're reinforced by those complexes of adaptive patterns based on natural ability, tendencies, being attractive, being effectively gregarious, that will be reinforced, and that behavior will manifest itself. So you can, and then other people, if you're shy, you're not used to developing a behavioral repertoire of engagement, then you feel more vulnerable. You don't feel like you compete very well, and you'll tend into that pattern. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, and just one small add-on that I want to ask about is the states versus traits. So let's say that, on the left side of the quadrant where you have hostility and all the negative stuff.
Mhm.
So if in a particular household, children are exposed to a lot of bad states, so where like the environment um, creates a lot of negative states in them.
Yep.
And so they stay on that side. And then like there's this false self, I guess that becomes bigger and bigger.
Good.
How much of that then affects your traits like openness, agreeableness, like
Yep.
even though the big five are pretty well known and stuff, but that type of upbringing can then change your traits actually. And then is there hope for people to work on those states and actually change them, change your traits?
Yep. Okay, great question. First off, we know that sort of in terms of a heritability quotient, we know that if we know your biological parents, let's say you count for 50 to 60% of the heritability, we're not really, so there's a lot that's unaccounted for, okay? Which at some level we presume experience fills in. But I will say that our knowledge of the kinds of events that generate and they create the emergence of the patterns of traits is not good. Okay, so we can fill in some of those gaps conceptually, but in terms of you look at the empirical data, okay, I'll give you I'll fill in the example that's one of the great mysteries of personality theory. All right, as far as I'm concerned, is the unbelievably low impact that shared environment has on shaping trait outcomes. I'll say that again. It's unbelievably low impact that shared environmental experiences have on shaping trait outcomes. So what do I mean by that? Well, so you have your biological parents, and then you have, let's say, your adoptive parents, okay? Everyone would have originally guessed that if you had an adoptive mom and dad who were high neurotic, okay, that should impact the neuroticism of their adoptive kid. Almost everybody thought that that would be the case. That has been confirmed that's not the case. Okay? We know that that's not the case. In other words, now don't get me wrong. What you do as a parent influences the outcome of your kids. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that if we measure your degree of neuroticism as an adoptive parent and then try to predict how neurotic your kids will be, all right, unbelievably low degree of predictability just straight from that. It's a miracle. I mean, everyone would have guessed it, that at 25%, it's more like 5%, okay? Over and over they find this, really, really uncertain. And if you think that siblings would be similar in raised environments, not at all, okay? Unbelievably different. Now, why? Well, lots of theories, not a lot of good empirical. And I have my own version of reality about how this works, okay? And I'd love, if I were an empiricist and I had another lifetime, I would do something to see, I like doing theory because I can always be right and not really have to deal with data. But, but there are good ideas about what might be happening, but it's tricky. Mike, I know you got a lot to say about this. If there's anything you want to chime in here, but at least that I'll put a limit on 5 to 10 minutes. You're muted.
Are you suggesting I'm verbose? I'm not going to say very much. I'm only going to say I think that I'm uncomfortable with trait concepts. You know that.
Right.
I don't actually believe in the concept of trait, the way in which psychologists tend to use it. The way I would, I'll say why. If you have a tree and it grows a certain height, that height doesn't change. And if you have a tree and you have its bark, and generally speaking, that the color of that bark remains the same. And so that the concept of trait comes from the physical world, where physical things have physical characteristics. Now we take that to the psychological world, and we make a very big mistake, I think, that we populate the person with these things and these characteristics. Well, people are dynamic. A shy person is not always shy. A shy person is shy in unfamiliar contexts, but when they're home, they're much less shy. And so anything that we call a trait is not a perfectly stable thing. The way I would suggest that we talk about quote unquote traits, I prefer to call them dynamic dispositions. And as a dynamic disposition, the best example of that, I think in what Greg was saying, was when you talked about quote unquote neuroticism as being the sensitivity of the negative affect system. Now that makes an awful lot of sense. So now I can actually point to something in an individual, the functioning of an affective system. The functioning of the affective system is not the trait. It's not the behavior. It's just simply the disposition of that system. In order to get behavior, you got to put that system in a context. We're always in a context, always relating in that context, and therefore that context modulates that system. Behavior, action is always an emergent product of those both things. So trait, fixes it, puts inside of the individual, and I think that's a big problem.
Yep.
Insofar as the shared non-shared variance thing, yeah, you're right. People thought that, oh, wow, shared variance is going to be really, really important, sharing. But if you give it a little bit of thought, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. If you ask any parent about their kids, they're going to tell you those kids is different right from the start. Right? You get very massive differences. And of course, two siblings in the same house must be treated differently because they're going to influence their parents and they're going to have different needs and the parents are going to have to interact with them differently. And we just don't do research that tracks the ways in which different kids interact with different contexts and move in different patterns. It's very hard to do. It's much easier to calculate heritability coefficients, which are very limited, in my opinion, with respect to the way in which real human actors engage in relations. And finally, the idea that personality is a bunch of traits, in my opinion, is kind of a vulgar notion.
That is totally true.
If you take Plomin's book on Blueprint, and he says, genes, how genes make you who you are. Your personality is who you are. Well, I'll tell you, I don't know about you, but who I am isn't my crankiness and all. I'm one of those bitter, cranky old people that you were talking
with
about.
A heart of gold, Mike.
Thank you. It's more my investments. It's more my sense of self. It's more my relation to you. It's more how I'm, it's more the symbolic representation of how I'm going to feel when I'm with my wife later on and that sort of thing. This is what a person is, not these kind of reductivistic trait type notions. That's all I got to say.
No, it's super important.
Okay, I have a question then. We're dealing with a lot of erroneous classification of people based upon skin pigmentation in this country. But would you say something about, I think you'll get into it, about how gender gets into it, how gender may influence a person's matrix. But how about ethnicity? How do we recognize the effects of ethnicity on, if you will, influence matrix practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that'll be interesting about gender is that you can generally take gender and you will see an interesting pattern emerge. Okay, with ethnicity, you're not going to see the complex, nuanced, richness dynamics of human interaction are not going to reveal themselves. I mean, there will be broad principles, like some people will feel we can then say, okay, in terms of social influence, there are certain categories that are privileged in relation, so we can say that, okay? But how that actually will then translate into, sort of ethnic tendencies around a wide variety of different domains. The complexity associated with that, you're not going to see too many reliable, valid patterns. Okay, that would be, say, okay, well, there will be some ethnic stereotypes that will have a cultural character. Okay, whereby the systems of justification and learning tend to channel individuals, perhaps in particular kinds of ways. All right, but those things those would be things that you'd have to go in there and use the matrix and justification to examine in a case-by-case, idiosyncratic, very, very nuanced, basis. Okay. Yeah, Lee.
Would it not be true that the minority group in most any culture would be towards a submissive rather than dominant pole of the power?
Not necessarily, because it depends on what you mean. By definition, minority has, in terms of the social value and normative conferral of influence and respect, yes, then that's a definition sort of what a majority becomes normative, and then that serves as the reference point. Okay, but if you go to the matrix and you're low on what we're really talking about is low on the black line of influence. Okay, and then people will navigate that low black line in a wide variety of different ways. Okay, like I worked a lot in inner city Philadelphia for 4 years. Okay, a subset of the individuals I work with are part of gangs. All right, I also worked in the big house for over a year, and there are a lot of ways to deal with the culture is anything but submissiveness. A hostile, antisocial counterculture, for instance. Fuck you. Okay, I ain't gonna play this game. All right, in reaction to being devalued. So that's the hostile anger, antisocial reactivity. When you lose social value, you basically are given what I call the defy, defer, split, which, by the way, is I think sort of really what the Oedipal complex really is about. And that is when somebody has power over you and hands that power to you, okay, you can defer and become submissive. And then I'm going to look up to you and you're my authority now, and I'll try to join you and follow. Or I'm going to defy. Screw you. I'm going to kill the father. I'm going to get angry and reject him. Yeah.
But I think what you're describing is a semblance of power because you're still in jail.
Yeah. Well, right. Obviously, at the level of influence, yes. Okay. But at the level of attitude, that's a different thing. So that's what I'm just teasing out.
The question about. Go ahead, Waldemar.
If you look at the British royal system, the royals, the true royals, are a distinct minority,
right?
But they have immense influence.
Yep.
I was going to say the same thing for South Africa under apartheid.
Yeah.
And indeed, what's happened in civilization is exactly that trend. So in hunter-gatherers, they were really, I've mentioned this, I think, at one other point, hunter-gatherers were organized by an anti-dominance communal autonomy relation. They really worked hard to create equity, and they could do that in close, tight-knit groups. Then we got civilization, okay? And then you got a power inequity, and we also saw a massive gender inequity because one of the genders seemed to be much more inclined to take risks, to acquire power, and to climb the social influence macro hierarchy across virtually, there are some matriarchal societies, the vast majority, however, especially the more centralized power, we saw in the last 10,000 years a very, very big shift in power dynamics, which has been fascinating and kind of tragic in some ways, definitely.
I have another question, but I want to make sure others don't have any comments or questions.
Yeah, I will note that it does seem to be that the men are asking questions.
Exactly.
Can I make a female male process dynamic? Shelley, yeah, Shelley Ann.
I did want to say that I really like the way that you framed the dynamism of how it is that we express who we are, Mike. You know, instead of that kind of static expression of personality, that fluid, dynamic way that you described. I liked that. I had a question, Greg, concerning lifespan and how, you know, things may change across the lifespan, but then Mike's comments kind of spoke to that.
Mm.
And then when I think it was Waldemar who raised the issue of ethnicity, that got me thinking about how that could be experienced or thought of, conceptualized differently in a culture like in the US, where you have more of a salad bowl in terms of ethnicity, where it might be easy to, not easy, surely not easy, but you know, you can make these observations because the different groups are more easily identifiable.
Mm.
I'm thinking from my framework as a Jamaican, where we have more of a melting pot.
Mhm.
So you would have the African persons of African descent who mixed, intermarried, mingled with persons of Indian descent, persons of Chinese descent, persons of Syrian descent, and then the Europeans as well. And you have a melting pot of a culture that would have produced something like reggae music that you
Mm.
can't say is purely African, or
Mhm,
you know,
mhm.
there are influences from so many different things in
Sure.
the expression, you know, of the culture. So when I think about Valdemar's question in relation to that, I just wondering, it just got my
Right,
mind.
right. No, that I think you're echoing sort of my own wondering or point about, well, you'd have to look and there'd be so much difference and unique. I mean, you know, the Afro-Caribbean experience and reggae, I mean, that's a unique confluence of different elements, right, that came together to produce that special particular.
Well, at the same time,
Tara?
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Somebody else.
Yeah, Tara, go ahead.
I had a question on movement along the matrix, and I
Mhm.
wanted to understand whether I understood this correctly when you were explaining it earlier, which, by the way, thank you. I haven't heard it explained this way, and I'm absorbing it, and I very much appreciate this discussion. So what I thought I heard when you talked about the emotions was
Mhm.
that emotion is a way to correct in some ways from where you have tracked yourself on the matrix. And then you spoke about the arrows, that how those responses are in themselves
Mhm.
a form of social influence. So
Yep.
I was just trying to understand what.
Okay. Yeah, it definitely takes a little bit. Okay. All right. So okay, so Andy's here, so we can use good real examples. All right. Okay. So I wrote this up at some point, and so let's say you come home. All right, and believe it or not, this has happened. And your husband says, "Hey, you know, I'll do the dishes." Okay. And then you go off to work and you do all this other stuff. Okay. And then you walk in, and lo and behold, you find a load of dishes. Okay. Instead of a cleaned up kitchen. Hypothetically, that's happened. Okay. All right. So then what happens to your structure when that occurs? Okay. So if I've said to you, I've made a social contract. I say, hey, dear, I will do the dishes. Now that's an expectation, okay, of investment and attention. When she walks in after working all day and sees it not done, it means I've reneged on my comment, okay, and you know I've left her with a task. So we can assume that she's going to get angry in relationship to that, okay. Now let's say she comes up the stairs and we'll say it's a miracle. And actually what's happening is I've been cleaning up the upstairs. Okay. Now all of a sudden, notice what will potentially happen to your structure. Okay. And that is, hey, I'm getting home. It's Friday night. You know, we'd rather not fight than fight. Okay. I'd rather be in a love mode than a non-love mode. At the same time, I've been told something that didn't happen, so I'm pissed. All right. So the anger in you is like, hey, you set expectations, you let me down, this happened before, blah, blah, blah. And then that's going to orient you to either dominate, okay, I'm going to assert, punish, why do you say that? Okay. And either, hey, we're enmeshed or I'm moving away. That's going to orient you. That's your upper left. Okay. At the same time, you may find that there's another part of you that says, wait a minute, do you have to be so angry? Hey, he cleaned the upstairs too, and he's actually kind of charming. Okay? Maybe. All right. So what you'll feel then is what's called an anger guilt pull. All right. So a part of you, which would the affiliative motive, all right, will say, hey, don't be too focused on you. Let this go. We can let it go and look at other positives. In other words, reward other, diminish my self-interest. That's your guilt voice. Okay. Love guilt. Then you have the anger hostile voice that says, screw them, you know, protect yourself and, you know, let them know what's going on. Okay. So that's the dynamic interplay, okay, in relation. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get to high social influence, avoid loss of influence. And those are two very common pathways that people will often feel very conflicted about. Okay. And in fact, when we do social skills training, one of the most basic social skills that we train on is people tend to either be passive. These tend to be the other-oriented individuals who are scared, tend to be submissive, dependent, and affiliative. They suppress their own interests and say, let it go, all right, on the one hand, versus individuals that are aggressive, hostile. You told me this, you did this wrong, you always do this, can't believe it, okay? That's what we actually try to train is assertiveness, okay, which is, hey, how do you explain what you need, understand as a problem, communicate it with an I statement, and articulate it with a balance that isn't extreme passive or aggressive, okay? Well, that's basically, that's the effective dialectic, okay, between power and love. Okay, so that's the way, that's how it operates in a dynamic here and now feedback loop, and how the different motives orient you. How your power autonomy motive often pulls against your love motive. Okay. Great question. Waldemar?
So if I might go back just for a moment to the idea about ethnicity, it seems to me what we've been talking about here is that every human being, intact human being, is born with a fundamental mechanism for the influence matrix.
Uh-huh.
And their experiences are going to mold, as well as their genes are going to mold how that is, that they use the influence matrix to obtain their goals in life. But I think there are times when we do recognize differences that appear to be differences in ethnicity that appear to be related to how the influence matrix influences the person or the group of people. For instance, there's a big difference between Western dominance I and Eastern side of we.
Uh-huh.
What I'm getting at is, it seems to me that it's extremely important to understand what are the forces that influence these different developments of the expression of the influence matrix. It seems to me that we're saying that yes, they are related to interpersonal interactions, and they're related to Bowlby's work, the bonding between child and parent. But aren't there also very large forces that come from the society and the culture that influence how?
I mean, 100%. So the rule, well, I mean, just at least in the unified theory, and Mike, you know, we are operating on the culture person plane of existence. Okay. So which means we're building our systems of justification that legitimizing and navigating our place at the verbal explicit level. All right. The influence matrix is like the shining hand of the flashlight that's going to frame our verbal justifications of legitimizing. But those verbal justifications that legitimize then create the normative structure upon which we engage. Okay. So for example, all right, in 1920s, let's say the power dynamics between husband and wife would probably in the normative household been quite different than they are in the 2020s. Okay. Because the normative justification in the United States generally is, you know, wife obey husband. Well, that ain't the way it works now. Okay. But that's the normative system of justification, which then legitimizes a totally different power structure. And then that creates a totally different history. If you go to East versus West, for instance, the normative system of justification is much more we communal in the East, where the frame of reference is the group cultural family context. That I am a part of a we is a default understanding of justificatory narration, and that's going to embed itself in the influence matrix about what people do, and vice versa. I mean, this is an iterative dynamic feedback process. Likewise, if you legitimize, oh, hey, what is it that where's your heart take you? What's your interest? What do you want to do in the hyper individualistic Western systems of justification about what and I, that creates a totally different narrative feedback loop. And that narrative creates an iterative process of how you represent yourself on the relational dynamic field. So yeah, I mean, the cultural, historical narratives play an enormous role in how the self-other processes are framed and legitimized. So there's a constant feedback loop there. Zach?
Could you show that yellow diagram? I want to ask a question. And I would like Mike also to comment on that, please. So a nerdy way of putting, like taking a look at this, and one way that I'm framing this inside of me, because for the longest time, the framing of this personality traits, and it just intuitively, some of this stuff didn't make sense to me, and it put me on the wrong path of thinking about other people and myself and my kids. After listening to what Mike and Greg, both of you said today, to me, it seems to me that these, when we look at the left side of this matrix, to the submission, hostility, autonomy, and dominance, for example, if we look at them as programs that run, and of course, on the right side too, there's the dependency, affiliation as well. And so depending on the context that these programs run, and then if you are, let's say, born in a household that there's a lot of hostility by default most of the times, that those programs would run more frequently. And so so your thinking, feeling, behaving patterns would be more influenced, and you'll behave in a certain way.
Definitely.
But if you were brought out of that and you were in a loving, caring environment, the context changes. So the personality, the traits and the states, that they are like Mike said, are dynamic. So is that the right way of thinking this, or am I missing something?
Yeah, no, I mean, that you're definitely, right. This is, what will happen is, so if you have somebody who's in this hostile environment, okay, they'll elaborate their episodic memories and behavioral repertoires around hostility. This will become an enriched part of their structure, okay? And relatively, their identities, their sense of security around trust and affiliation will be, and pathways for that connection will be impoverished. So their propensity to activate a hostile program, okay, they have much more access to it, they have much more history with it, it's much more elaborated. All right. And if other people are running hostile programs are reciprocal. In other words, you get pissed, I get pissed back at you, and they feed on each other. Okay. So then you get a feedback dynamic in that environment. Now you're going to take somebody out of that scenario. Okay. And you drop them in a different, now that gives them an opportunity potentially to develop another set of strategies. However, let's be clear, as anybody who knows that worked in foster homes know, okay, that now if you have an insecure attachment with a lot of history and you're not going to trust what system that you're in, it can be a pretty loving environment, and that person can still be pretty defensive and hostile. Okay, they don't want to be taken advantage of. They don't have trust. They don't have access to a lot of those repertoires. They haven't seen those things unreasonably, so they need a lot of evidence. They engage in a lot of testing behavior. And they probably also need some modeling and some skill building, okay, to develop those repertoires. All right. So each one of these is pattern repertoire. One of the things I notice most frequently, for instance, for people that are other-oriented, have social phobias and anxieties, is that they do not develop angry, sort of assertive modes of being. In other words, they don't know how to effectively use the stick to defend themselves, to use the tool that Zach talks about sometimes. When you bring out a stick and say, no, how do you do that? All right. if you don't develop repertoires of assertive defense, actually sometimes what happens when I'm training somebody who's tends to not be very assertive and they're learning to be assertive, sometimes they actually come out and they say, well, I told that guy, no way, that's ridiculous and you're an idiot. And it's like, whoa, it's like, okay, well, we're learning, that's where you started. You got a primitive hostile notion. And actually it was I'm glad you were assertive, but actually it came out kind of ineffective, because they don't have a lot of skill in that mode. And they started with the basics. And at this stage, the basics can feel kind of immature, So then you train that and you're enriching that and all of that. And indeed, emotional intelligence is having access to all these feeling states with very rich repertoires of how they inform you, what they mean, and what they might guide you in terms of behavioral propensities over time.
So Zach, I'm not sure what your question was, but if you put up the slide again, if you'd be so kind, Greg.
Of course.
One of the things that I find most exciting about this matrix has to do with what Tara was talking about before when she was talking about movement. That, in my opinion, the value of this is its dynamism, not its fixedness.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that you could move from one slot to another, you can move from one place to another, that we can characterize individuals within the space. An individual is not a point. No. It's not, an individual is the movement, and that you're moving around the space in some way, and that's an inherently dynamic notion. And with respect to ethnicity, what Waldemar was talking about, it seems to me that different ethnicities can be defined in terms of different areas of movement within the space, or that even that there's a dome above it of values that says these, autonomy is to be valued and dependency is not, or versus dependency is to be valued and autonomy is not.
Exactly.
And so those are wonderful ways I think that this could be used.
Yeah, the dome of value is exactly right. And go ahead. Did I cut you off?
Only when I need to be. I'm uncomfortable with the notion of thinking of the various words here as programs. In my opinion, that fixes it. It makes them into things. It makes them into discrete things. I think that one of the tensions between Greg and I when we think about this matrix is, Greg talked about it as almost that the matrix is inside of you, that there's a template inside of you. I don't believe that. I think this matrix is very, very exciting and very powerful, but I believe it is emergent. I believe that this describes emergent relations between people. You can't have autonomy by yourself, and you can't have autonomy independent of dependency. So it's not that, there's a little autonomy program inside of you that gets activated, but that these modes of being are developing in relation to each other over time, and that they emerge, and then a person emerges as the movement of the space within this emergent system.
I like this framing better than program, Mike. It resonates with me that I can imagine these to be these zones that we're able to move from these zones from one zone to the other. So, thank you.
Yeah, and that's I'm willing to put more inside the individual than Mike is, perhaps, but we're basically in complete agreement. Like when we thought about attachment, first they were talking about kids had, were you a securely attached kid or an insecurely attached kid? And then they realized, oh my God, a kid can be securely attached to dad and insecurely attached to mom. Who would have thunk it? And then really what attachment fundamentally is the dance, the dance of interaction, okay? And it is the case that through the dance of interaction, of course, then kids walk around with internal working models and they develop self-concepts, and then they start playing out these internal family representations. And over the course of development, by the time you get to adult, you get a population of representations that does tend to trend you, and you have all of these kind of dynamic relations. So when you enter into a relation with somebody, you bring that architectural history. So, you know, whether it's inside or between, it's an intrapsychic, interpersonal dynamic field of adaptation over time. And so, and the other thing I want to say about Mike is when I write about this in the book, I track one of my favorite movies of all time. I'm not a huge fan of a lot of psychological movies, but one of my favorite movies is Ordinary People. Anybody seen Ordinary People? Okay. So it's won Best Picture in 1980, directed by Robert Redford. So if you know the story, I can send the link. What I show in terms of dynamism is it's a story about a family that deals with tragedy. The oldest son gets killed in a boating accident. It's upper middle class Chicago family. Mom is very over controlled, okay, and doesn't know how to show warmth. It opens with the son having made a suicide attempt and dealing with depression, PTSD, and other kinds of things. Okay, I mark a culminating scene. All right, in the son now has gotten to see some therapy. He's doing a little better. He was driven to be on the swim team. All right. But then he realized he hated swim team or needed to assert his independence. Okay. And it's now Christmas, and they bring home a tree, and dad and son are pulling the tree together. Actually, dad's more of a maternal caretaker figure in this, and mom's kind of cold and aloof. She comes in and she says, huh, and you could tell her face is she's really upset. And they say, what's going on? And she learned from her friend that he had quit the swim team for the past month. Okay. And she's like, what the hell's going on? You know, and he's like, well, I didn't feel like doing it. You know, it's like, well, why didn't you tell us? It's because, well, I didn't want you to deal with it, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And then this gives rise to a culminating core. You want to know what the core self is? So she never came up and visited him in the hospital. Okay. When he had made a suicide attempt, he was there for like 6 weeks. Mom never came and visited him. All right. And there's this culminating scene where he's been given voice through his therapy about how he feels about himself, how he feels about his mother. It's breaking through to his consciousness that his mother is withholding, and that hurts. And you see his rage, okay? Conrad's rage. He breaks out. He's like, you never went to the hospital, blah, blah, blah. How the hell could you not come over there? You know, and the father says, well, she was sick. You know, she was sick and she couldn't come. And he was like, if Buck would have been in the hospital, you would have gone to the goddamn hospital. Buck's the son. You see that I get all, you know. And she said, Buck would have never been in the hospital. Okay. Yeah. And so there it is, right? The son that I love, who shouldn't have died, would have never tried put me through that, you bastard. Okay. And so she pops his relational bubble. He's trying to assert himself. He's trying to get dominant. He's trying to control mom, show her that he's worth something, that he deserves, that she's not treated him. And mom just poof. Okay. And what do you see? What happens? Conrad runs upstairs. All right. Okay. What is the next scene? Dad comes into the bedroom. He's like, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Okay. In other words, guilt, submission, I'm done. Okay. And, you know, I don't have it in me. All right. So he goes from rage to try to control her to show his worth, but she controls him as a mother and shows him what he's been terrified of. And then that goes to his fundamental attachment heart, and that deflates him into his inferior shame. And so then you see the shame, the guilt, the defeatedness, and then I want to escape this. I can't win this conflict. So he gets very, very guilt-ridden. Okay. So in that scene, you see the dynamism of him moving from, oh my God, I'm going to try to control mom. I'm going to be assertive. She then reaches the threshold. She actually demonstrates her power, and he defeated, and he runs away. Okay. So, and that's why I used it to show how powerful. It's not like he's angry or submissive here, and show how quickly the program tendency, disposition in the dynamic dance of relation can emerge. So it's a really great movie, and it's a powerful scene.
You know, note how dialectical the whole thing is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we hear an awful lot about eliminating binaries. You know, well, there's all types of binaries, and we need them. They're dialectical.
That's right.
The question is that there's space between the binaries, and we move back and forth constantly in them until we build new and more sophisticated structures that maybe are beyond the binaries.
Right.
Yeah, it's a really good matrix, Kaman.
Yeah, Lee?
Yeah, I just wanted to share, I hesitate to follow ordinary people, but I just wanted to share a very simple example that might illustrate both the dynamic nature of the matrix and the program nature of it. And so most of my career was as a middle manager. So what happens is, and think of the power dimension here, okay? As a middle manager, when you're meeting with your group, you're dominant. And when you meet with your boss, you're submissive. So dynamically, like back and forth, like you might be meeting with your boss, with your group, and get a call from your boss. You got to switch from dominant to submissive, submissive, whatever, dominant to submissive quickly.
Right.
So that's the dynamic aspect of it. But the program aspect of it is, I know what to do in both cases, okay? So that's kind of the practice role aspect of it. So that might be just a simple example that illustrates those two
Absolutely.
aspects.
Absolutely. And of all the species, by the way, we're an unbelievably social species, and we're unbelievably interesting in our sociality. Some other species do it, but we are able to switch into so many different roles. A lot of species, like, okay, you're dominant. You're as dominant as long as you hold it. Then somebody throws you off, and then you're submissive. In other words, but as your example is like, 1 minute you're dominant, and then the next minute you're submissive. 1 minute you're affiliative. Then all of a sudden you got to navigate, because these are such, the relations of cooperation that we have are so intimate. We're so dependent upon one another. So you have to regulate. We're very, very intertwined, and we're able to take so many different roles on a dime. It's a very, very cool aspect of being human. Okay, well, it's almost 7 o'clock. We went with the matrix much more than gender. And maybe we can have another conversation about gender sometime. If there were any particular questions about gender, I want to make sure that if this sparked any, we certainly can, and obviously if anybody has to go, we can go. But were there any questions about gender that at least folks brought in that they would like to have an opportunity to discuss? Okay. Was that a question? Anyway, okay. All right. Well, maybe we'll have a conversation about gender some other time. It's a pretty interesting topic, certainly. And you can perhaps imagine how the matrix might say some things about gender and gender tendencies, and then we can start to wonder where they come from. And we'll come back. And at some point, I will tell you my relational field independence versus relational field dependence view of what one of the key features that tends to define the genders quite differently. But we'll save that for another conversation. Yeah, Tara.
I had a quick question that goes back to one of the questions you posted on your slide, which was, what is the core social need, I think is what it said. And I just wanted to circle back to that to understand.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. So what and that's the RVSI line. Okay. And so what does it mean? Basically what it means is that we're in social coordinates. We see ourselves as in social coordinates, and we see people as having social influence worth. Okay. And we're tracking ourselves in relationship to that. It's called social comparison. So we'll make comparisons upward, who has more, who has less. Okay. We will desire more and fear losing less. We'll feel better when we look downward social comparison. We might feel aspirational looking up, or we might feel shame. Okay. We were constantly tracking. Okay. So for example, I was amazed. My son might be 3, my daughter 5, somebody cutting a birthday cake. There's, the cake's gigantic. We're never going to eat it all. You give one, you give the other, hey, her piece is bigger than mine. Okay. That's like, well, there's plenty of cake. No, but I'm tracking. How do you cut the cake relative to me? What's your, how are you guiding me? So social influence, how we invest. And then in terms of the core sense of your relational value. So this looks into, to what extent are the important people in my life, do they know who I am at my core relative to the persona I put on? Okay. And do they value me and to the way I want to be valued? Okay. So this, I believe, is the core psychosocial nourishment of the soul. All right. So I want to look at somebody across their lifespan, and I want to see when they were born, were they born into a family that knew and valued them or not, or one riddled with hostility and vulnerability? When they grew up in their siblings, how did they navigate the sibling relations? When they transitioned into kindergarten, through kindergarten, okay? Were they known and valued by a subset of friends? How did they fit into the social influence matrix? In fact, if you want one variable more than any other that's going to determine whether somebody is miserable and dysfunctional, track them from 5 to 13 and find the kids who have no mentors and who are isolated and alone, dejected, isolated kids from that time period. That's a devastating developmental blow. Okay. So how are your friends? Then how do you move into romantic partners once you have, and then how does your identity feed back on you? How do you know and love yourself? Okay. And then are you able to socialize and grow into socialized groups where you feel known and valued or not?
So what would your answer to Tara's question be in four words or less?
The core psychosocial need is to be known and valued by important others across those domains.
Right. And what's interesting about that is that there are so many different ways of being valued, that they can be different cultures can have different ways of valuing, and so it's a very powerful notion.
Right. And you can be valued but not feel known. That's another. I used to say relational value. Then I realized that a lot of people feel valued, but they also feel like they're imposters. Okay. So in other words, they're not really known as to who they are. They're valued for their persona.
Very nice. Very nice, Greg.
Hey.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Hey,
Greg.
thank you so much. I appreciate
Very
everybody
interesting.
coming, and enjoy the stimulating conversation as we engage in transformational learning towards thriving.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
All righty, guys.
Thank you. Good to
Rock
see you
on.
all.
Take care. Are you there, Joe?
Joe, are you lurking? That's just his persona, man.
He's looking a little flat these days.
Yeah, he is.
All right, I'll put him in the waiting room if he wants to come back.
So that was great.
Good.
That's great. I really, it's a good model. It's a very good model. Good for you.
We'll talk more about the intrapsychic interpersonal dynamic relation. But
I think there's a lot of power here.
so.
A lot of power. Yeah. Good man.
Well, for building common ground, that's why I said that the themes of needs and values, I believe, are going to be vertical, horizontal, distancing.
That makes a lot of sense.
So, okay.
Great.
All right, brother.
Good man.
Love you.
Be well. Be cool.
Yep. Peace.